Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine Bolivia's escalating anti-government protests, which are increasingly challenging the authority of President Rodrigo Paz and causing widespread disruption across the country. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we look at Russia's intensifying long-range strike campaign against Ukraine and the growing risk posed by interceptor shortages. We also assess the continuing diplomatic deadlock between the United States and Iran, the killing of a senior Islamic State leader in Nigeria, a worsening Ebola outbreak in the DRC and Uganda, demonstrations in Kenya linked to rising fuel prices, unrest in Comoros, and the prospect of electricity supply cuts in Johannesburg. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover severe flooding across southern and central China, which is likely to drive further disruption and additional casualties in the days ahead. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where protests in Bolivia continue to escalate, causing major disruption and increasing pressure on President Rodrigo Paz. On May 15th, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office issued an advisory against all travel to the Department of La Paz, including the administrative capital, La Paz, and the city of El Alto. The advisory followed an escalation in violent protests that have intensified since the beginning of May. On May 18th and 19th, large-scale demonstrations were recorded in La Paz. These led to widespread vandalism, attacks on government buildings, and day-long clashes between protesters and police. The protests coincided with the arrival in the capital of supporters of former President Evo Morales. They had staged a 6-day march from Oruro in the Andes and were reportedly equipped with dynamite and other weapons. Morales, the former president and leader of the Movement for Socialism Party, has endorsed the protest movement. On May 15th, he claimed that President Rodrigo Paz's right-wing government had been instructed by the United States to carry out a military operation aimed at capturing or killing him. Furthermore, on May 20th, Morales announced what he described as a 90-day ultimatum to Paz. He called on the president to resign and organize new elections or face a coordinated escalation of the unrest. Protesters have imposed a de facto blockade on La Paz, blocking key roads into the capital and causing localized shortages of fuel, basic goods, and medical supplies. They have also blocked all roads to El Alto, effectively cutting off access to the airport that serves the capital. Beyond La Paz, unrest has been recorded in several other regions. In Cochabamba, Morales' political stronghold, multiple blockades have been established, and similar disruptions have been reported in Oruro and Santa Cruz. On May 19th, what organizers described as indefinite protests began in Chuquisaca. In Chapare, protesters occupied an airport, forcing a shutdown of operations. The protests have so far resulted in at least 4 deaths, dozens of injuries, and more than 100 arrests. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. As the protest movement continues to gain traction, it has likely evolved in both scope and demands. The unrest began over grievances linked to policies introduced by the centre-right government, elected in October 2025. It has since broadened into calls for President Paz to be removed from office. The administration has almost certainly struggled to respond to the scale of the unrest. While it has reached agreements with some unions, these concessions have proved insufficient to prevent the movement from continuing to escalate. The Paz government almost certainly faces significant structural constraints that limit its ability to address the root causes of the unrest. It is unlikely to present a credible policy alternative capable of restoring order in the short term while also preserving institutional integrity. Alongside the severe economic crisis confronting Bolivia, the government likely lacks both the political legitimacy and the parliamentary support required to enact meaningful reforms without triggering a substantial backlash. A significant portion of the electorate assesses that its victory in the October 2025 general election was secured primarily as a result of the collapse of the movement for socialism, rather than through a strong and independent mandate. In the immediate term, violent unrest is likely to continue in La Paz and in rural parts of Bolivia, particularly in Chapare, where Morales retains a strong base of support. Given the reported use of explosives by protesters, alongside the forceful response from security personnel, there is a realistic possibility of further fatalities. Any additional deaths would likely exacerbate the unrest. There is a realistic possibility that the Paz government will increasingly deploy coercive measures to contain the protests, particularly if the blockade of La Paz continues. Such efforts would primarily focus on securing the capital, but would almost certainly provoke a violent reaction, making attacks on security forces and police more likely. In rural areas, these could take the form of ambushes on police units responding to blockades. A previous example occurred in June 2025 in the mining town of Lalahua, where 3 officers were killed. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where Russia has intensified its long-range strike campaign against Ukraine amid growing concerns over Ukrainian interceptor shortages. In an address on May 17th, President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that, during the previous week, Russian forces had launched more than 3,170 attack drones, over 1,300 glide bombs, and 74 missiles, causing 52 deaths and 346 injuries. Overnight, between May 17th and 18th, Russian forces launched another large-scale aerial attack involving 546 attack drones and decoys, 14 ballistic missiles, and 8 cruise missiles, with Dnipropetrovsk Oblast particularly affected. According to figures published by the Ukrainian Air Force, air defenses failed to intercept any of the ballistic missiles. The escalated Ukrainian deep strike campaign also continued, with a major wave of attacks conducted overnight between May 16th and 17th. Russian forces claimed that 556 attack drones were intercepted, including 130 in the Moscow region. Reported targets struck included the Moscow refinery and the Angstrom semiconductor plant. Earlier, on May 15th, President Zelensky warned that Ukrainian intelligence had obtained Russian documents containing coordinates and satellite imagery for around 20 political and military sites. These reportedly included presidential facilities and underground sites in Kiev. Furthermore, Russia began an unannounced strategic nuclear exercise on May 19th, scheduled to run until May 21st. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that the exercise involves more than 64,000 personnel, over 200 missile launchers, 73 ships, and 13 submarines. 8 of these are nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines capable of launching nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles from both the Northern and Pacific fleets. The exercise also reportedly involved the pre-staging of nuclear munitions in Belarus. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The Victory Day ceasefire between May 9th and 11th, although marked by continued limited offensive operations and repeated mutual accusations of violations, did lead to a truce in long-range strikes conducted by either Ukraine or Russia. However, in the week following the ceasefire, Russia has launched more attack drones and decoys against Ukraine than in any 7-day period since the start of the full-scale invasion. It is likely that Ukraine is currently experiencing a meaningful and officially understated shortage of the PAC-3 interceptors used in the Patriot air defense system. As Patriot is Ukraine's primary means of intercepting ballistic missiles, critical interceptor shortages have previously led to very high penetration rates of Russian ballistic missiles against high-value targets in Ukraine. In mid-January 2026, President Zelensky stated that Ukraine's air defense systems were suffering from a shortage of interceptor missiles until a substantial package arrived. Comparing interception figures published by the Ukrainian Air Force from Russian strikes in January, it is notable that, following the delivery of additional interceptors, 14 out of 18 Iskander-M ballistic missiles were intercepted. In an earlier January attack, by contrast, only 2 out of 18 were intercepted. The failure of Ukrainian air defenses to intercept any of the 14 Iskander-M missiles launched between May 17th and 18th, alongside observable declines in recent interception rates overall, supports the assessment that Ukraine is suffering from a critical interceptor shortage. However, other factors could also have contributed. These include the relatively low concentration of Patriot systems positioned to defend Dnipro and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, reportedly the main targets of the attack. Another factor is the increasing use of Iskander-M variants that deploy electronic warfare countermeasures and execute evasive maneuvers during the terminal phase, making their flight paths harder to track and intercept with Patriot systems. Kyiv almost certainly faces challenges in replacing depleted interceptor stockpiles due to a global shortage of PAC-3 MSE interceptors. This shortage has been heavily exacerbated by the conflict in the Middle East, with some estimates suggesting that the United States expended 50% of its PAC-3 MSE interceptors against Iranian missiles during the recent conflict. Following President Vladimir Putin's highly likely overture to an increasingly war-fatigued domestic audience that the war in Ukraine is coming to an end on Victory Day, it is likely that the Kremlin aims to achieve profound progress in the war during the summer of 2026. With conditions improving following the winter and the spring Rasputitsa or mud season, the ongoing spring-summer 2026 Russian ground offensive is likely to intensify further in the near term. The offensive almost certainly seeks to threaten the envelopment of the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration in unoccupied Donetsk Oblast, which would critically threaten Ukraine's highly defensible fortress belt. However, ongoing Russian ground offensive operations have faced major difficulties. Should Russian forces fail to secure significant gains by the autumn, it is likely that the Kremlin will further intensify its long-range strike campaign as its principal instrument of coercion against Ukraine. The strategic nuclear exercises are almost certainly intended primarily as a strategic message to NATO and Ukraine's allies regarding the risks of nuclear escalation, with the aim of conditioning reduced support for Ukraine, rather than representing a meaningful preparatory step towards nuclear use. Instead, the most likely remaining courses of escalation for Russia involve further intensifying its long-range strike campaign. This could include strikes against targets in central Kyiv. Russia's Ministry of Defense previously threatened massive strikes on central Kyiv in response to alleged violations of the Victory Day ceasefire. More recently, Russian documents reportedly obtained by Ukrainian intelligence appear to indicate preparations for strikes against Ukrainian decision-making centers. The significantly intensified Russian long-range strike campaign has almost certainly already made the threat environment in Ukrainian cities far from the front lines, particularly Kyiv, the most severe since the initial stages of the full-scale invasion. If Ukraine is confirmed to be suffering from critical interceptor shortages and Russian forces escalate their targeting profile to increasingly include high-value targets in central Kyiv, the risks facing travelers in Ukraine would be further exacerbated. Turning to the Middle East, efforts to secure a breakthrough between the United States and Iran continue, though both sides remain far apart on key demands. On May 17th, as the United States awaited a revised proposal from Tehran, President Donald Trump stated that the clock is ticking for Iran, and that they are going to get hit much harder if the demanded concessions were not made. Later that day, Pakistani mediators shared the revised Iranian proposal with the United States, but it was again rejected as insufficient. The revised proposal reportedly included more detail regarding a commitment not to pursue a nuclear weapon. However, it still lacked detailed commitments from Iran on suspending uranium enrichment or relinquishing its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. On May 18th, following the rejection of the revised proposals, President Trump stated that the United States had planned to conduct strikes against Iran on May 19th, but that these were called off following calls with the leaders of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. President Trump told the media that the Arab leaders had asked him to hold off on strikes for 2 or 3 days. He also warned that the deadline for a diplomatic breakthrough from Tehran was maybe Friday or Saturday, early next week. On May 19th, President Trump reportedly held a difficult call with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, during which sources briefed that Trump outlined how the United States and Iran are working on a letter of intent. This coincided with reports on May 20th from Saudi Arabian state-owned media that serious efforts are underway to finalize a draft agreement, with a potential next round of negotiations to be held in Islamabad after the Hajj season, between May 25th and 27th. The reports also stated that Pakistan's Interior Minister had met directly with the Iranian president. A U.S. source claimed that the letter of intent would involve a formal end to the war, alongside the launch of a 30-day negotiation period focused on the nuclear file and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Since the implementation of the ceasefire on April 8th, President Donald Trump has repeatedly threatened to renew strikes against Iran if Tehran refuses to concede to U.S. demands. These repeated warnings have likely reduced the credibility of U.S. threats aimed at compelling Iranian compliance. However, it is highly likely that Iranian forces have maintained the highest possible level of readiness under the assumption that full-scale war could restart imminently. The Iranian peace proposals have reportedly included demands for sanctions relief, an end to the U.S. naval blockade, the withdrawal of U.S. forces from areas close to Iran, the full release of frozen assets, reparations, guarantees against further attacks, an end to the war on all fronts, including Lebanon, and recognition of Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. According to Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps affiliated media reports, the United States has rejected reparations, demanded the transfer of Iran's stockpiled highly enriched uranium to the U.S., and agreed to release only 25% of Iran's frozen assets. Furthermore, the reports claim that the United States is offering no guarantees against future U.S. or Israeli strikes if subsequent, more comprehensive negotiations fail. The two parties are likely to remain at a diplomatically unresolvable impasse unless either side shifts on its red lines, particularly regarding the nuclear file and the Strait of Hormuz. The Trump administration continues to demand meaningful concessions on Iran's nuclear program as part of an initial peace agreement, whereas Tehran has pushed to delay nuclear negotiations until after a resolution is reached to end the U.S. blockade. However, the U.S. blockade is almost certainly the primary source of leverage being applied against Iran to compel meaningful concessions on the nuclear file. Although the time frame for a significant Iranian oil shut-in likely extends over several months. Ending the blockade before reaching a nuclear agreement would likely further enable the hardened regime in Tehran to resist making such concessions. If reports regarding a potentially imminent signed letter of intent are accurate, the agreement likely amounts to an effective extension of the ceasefire, with resolution of the key red line issues for each side, the nuclear file and control over the Strait of Hormuz, deferred to a subsequent 30-day negotiation period. If these negotiations proceed, they will likely be characterized by a similar diplomatic impasse, requiring either the United States or Iran to shift on their respective red lines. With the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps increasingly consolidating control in Iran, it is likely that the hardened regime will be unwilling to make significant concessions that could be perceived as capitulating to the United States. Instead, it may prefer a renewed full-scale conflict, which it almost certainly calculates it could survive. However, there is a realistic possibility that the Trump administration may conclude that the economic and political costs of the war have become sufficiently severe that it is willing to accept a compromised end state, involving only marginal movement from Tehran, compared with what was on the table prior to the outbreak of the conflict on February 28th. In West Africa, a joint US-Nigerian operation has killed a senior Islamic State leader and more than 175 ISWAP fighters, likely prompting retaliatory attacks. On May 16th, President Donald Trump stated that U.S. Africa Command and Nigerian forces had killed the second-in-command of Islamic State, Abu Bilal al-Minuki. He was reportedly killed alongside several of his lieutenants in a targeted missile strike on his compound in Metele, Borno State, in the Lake Chad Basin. Intelligence had reportedly identified a fortified base in the area. According to the Nigerian military, the operation began at midnight on May 16th, following months of intelligence gathering and reconnaissance supported by the United States. 24 operators arriving by helicopter reportedly engaged militants on 2 small islands in the Lake Chad Basin, with the objective of capturing al-Minuki. Following a 3-hour firefight, an airstrike was launched against al-Minuki's compound to avoid the risk of his escape. Additional strikes were carried out on May 17th in the Metele area of Borno State, following reports that Islamic State fighters had converged there. Further strikes were conducted on May 19th. According to the Nigerian military, more than 175 Islamic State West Africa Province, or ISWAP, members have been killed in the joint Nigerian-US strikes. The operation also reportedly targeted ISWAP checkpoints, weapons caches, logistics hubs, military equipment, and financing networks used by the wider Islamic State network. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Although President Trump and AFRICOM identified al-Minuki as Islamic State's second-in-command, he had not previously been identified as the group's deputy leader. While Islamic State has not officially commented on the strike, online supporter channels have largely downplayed the operation. Some have mocked the suggestion that al-Minuki was the second most important figure in the organization's global hierarchy, while others have referred to reports from 2024 claiming that he was already dead. In a February 2026 report, the United Nations Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team identified al-Minuki as the head of the Islamic State Al-Furqan office, a regional office that supports the group in managing its global affairs and transferring funds to other Islamic State wilayats, or provinces. The office also oversees and coordinates activity between Islamic State West Africa Province in northeast Nigeria and the Sahel-based Islamic State Sahel Province. According to Nigerian intelligence, al-Minuki rose in prominence following the killing of former ISWAP chief Maman Noor in 2018, and assumed the role of General Directorate of States around February 2026. Al-Minuki previously served as a senior Boko Haram officer and has been linked to several Boko Haram and Islamic State-linked operations across the Sahel and West Africa. The most recent major operation linked to him was the Islamic State Sahel Province attack on Niamey Airport in Niger in January 2026, during which ISWAP is suspected to have provided significant support, including the provision of drones and training in their use. He was also reportedly connected to the 2018 Dapchi schoolgirls kidnapping, in which more than 100 girls from a boarding school in Borno State were abducted by Boko Haram. While al-Minuki may not have been Islamic State's second-in-command, it is highly likely that his previous militant experience, his role in channeling funds, and his coordination between Islamic State networks in the Lake Chad Basin, the Sahel, and the wider global organization made him a strategically important target. Moreover, unconfirmed reports indicate that he was planning attacks against the United States and U.S. interests in the region. There have been no widely reported external operations attributed to ISWAP, unlike branches such as Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, and Islamic State Khorasan Province, or ISKP. However, ISWAP has deepened its integration with Islamic State global networks, developed more mature capabilities, and is currently one of the group's most active provinces. These developments have likely emboldened the organization. If ISWAP was in the early stages of planning or financing external operations against U.S. interests outside its primary area of operations, this would almost certainly have elevated al-Manuki to a Pillar 1 target for U.S. counter-terrorism operations. The United States has maintained an established presence in Nigeria since November 2025. So far, U.S. operations have largely targeted Islamic State Sahel province cells in Sokoto State, in northwest Nigeria. This is the first publicly reported kinetic U.S. strike in Borno State. The strikes targeting al-Manuki and other Islamic State fighters highly likely indicate that the United States will conduct further counterterrorism operations in Borno State. This is likely to be a significant development in efforts to suppress the ISWAP and Boko Haram insurgencies, both of which have increased their operational tempo in 2026, despite intensified Nigerian security force operations. Retaliatory attacks are highly likely in the short term, with ISWAP particularly likely to target Nigerian military camps. Also in the region, health authorities are responding to a growing Ebola outbreak that has now prompted the World Health Organization to declare a public health emergency of international concern. On May 17, the World Health Organization declared the Ebola outbreak in the DRC and Uganda a public health emergency of international concern. So far, there have been 600 suspected cases and 139 suspected deaths. The outbreak originated in the DRC's northeastern Ituri province, which borders South Sudan and Uganda. The province has so far recorded approximately 246 suspected cases, although only 51 have been confirmed, along with 80 deaths. Another case has been confirmed in AFCM 23 controlled Goma in North Kivu, close to the border with Rwanda. 2 cases have also been confirmed in Uganda. However, World Health Organization Director General Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus stated that there are significant uncertainties regarding the true number of infected people and the geographic spread of the outbreak. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The current strain of Ebola is caused by the Bundibugyo virus, a strain for which no vaccines are currently available. According to the WHO, it could take up to 9 months for a vaccine to be developed. Outbreaks are typically linked to human interaction with infected animals, such as fruit bats. The disease then spreads between people through infected bodily fluids, including blood and vomit. Early symptoms include fever, muscle pain, fatigue, headache, and a sore throat. As the disease progresses, these are followed by vomiting, diarrhea, rash, and bleeding. Ebola has an average case fatality rate of approximately 50%. According to the World Health Organization, confirmed cases should be immediately isolated and treated until 2 Bundibugyo tests, taken 48 hours apart, return negative results. Most Ebola outbreaks are relatively small. The last major outbreak took place in West Africa between 2014 and 2016 and was the largest Ebola outbreak since the virus was first discovered in 1976. Beginning in Guinea, the Zaire strain of Ebola, which has an untreated fatality rate of approximately 90%, quickly spread to Sierra Leone and Liberia. In August 2014, the World Health Organization declared the outbreak a public health emergency of international concern after 961 deaths had been recorded among 1,779 reported cases. During the epidemic, Ebola also spread to Italy, Mali, Nigeria, Senegal, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The outbreak was declared over in June 2016 after 28,600 people had been infected and 11,325 had died. A major contributor to the early spread of the virus during the 2014 to 2016 epidemic was community funerals, where people helped wash the bodies of their loved ones. The World Health Organization's decision to declare this outbreak a public health emergency of international concern, despite far fewer detected cases, is highly likely influenced by several factors. First, this outbreak was detected later than the 2014 outbreak, which was identified at 49 cases and 29 deaths. That delay makes the outbreak harder to contain, with more people potentially exposed. Second, Eastern DRC continues to face multiple insurgencies. The Islamic State-linked Allied Democratic Forces and the Cooperative for Development of the Congo both maintain a significant presence in Ituri. This makes it more difficult to control the spread of the disease and access affected areas. Third, the lack of a vaccine almost certainly makes it harder to immunize the population. Finally, the scaling back of the United States Agency for International Development and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, both of which led the international response to the 2014 epidemic, will almost certainly make responding to the outbreak more difficult. Countries bordering the DRC's Ituri, North Kivu, and South Kivu regions, particularly South Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi, are almost certainly at risk of the virus spreading across their borders due to high levels of trade and travel. While Rwanda has closed its border crossings with the DRC, the porous nature of the DRC's borders almost certainly increases the risk of further disease spread. The World Health Organization has recommended that the DRC and Uganda establish emergency operations centers to support monitoring, contact tracing, and the implementation of infection prevention and control measures. It has also advised countries not to close borders or restrict travel and trade, stating that such measures are usually implemented out of fear and have no basis in science. Further reports of confirmed cases are highly likely in the coming weeks, with a realistic possibility of the outbreak spreading to neighboring countries. Meanwhile, Uganda has introduced new legislation aimed at curbing foreign influence, a move critics argue could restrict NGO activity and political opposition. On May 18th, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni signed the Protection of Sovereignty Bill, a draft law designed to curb foreign influence. The legislation criminalizes advancing a foreigner's interests against the interests of Uganda and bars anyone acting on behalf of foreign interests from developing or implementing policy without government approval. The bill also introduces mandatory government approvals, a cap on foreign funding, new registration requirements, and criminal penalties for non-compliance, including up to 10 years in prison and significant fines. Some provisions included in earlier versions of the bill have since been softened. These include a measure that would have required any Ugandan receiving money from abroad to register as a foreign agent. The requirement now applies only to individuals receiving funds for political purposes that advance foreign interests. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Human rights groups and opposition figures argue that the amended bill could deter donor support, complicate engagement by international partners, and negatively affect investment flows and service delivery in Uganda. Although the May 18th version appears to narrow the earlier definitions of foreigner and agent of a foreigner and introduces exemptions for some lawful financial flows, it still gives the government broad powers to regulate foreign-funded activity linked to policy, governance, elections, or public decision-making. This means NGO activity that is perceived as opposing or influencing government policy remains at risk of restriction or criminalization. As a result, it is highly likely that NGOs will feel compelled to temper criticism of the government in anticipation of retaliation. The bill was almost certainly introduced to help the government tighten control over political opposition in the country. President Yoweri Museveni has increasingly cracked down on opposition activity, including by enabling military tribunals to try civilians. His government has also employed internet blackouts and security crackdowns during demonstrations and election periods. Security forces have repeatedly disrupted opposition rallies, particularly those linked to Bobi Wine's National Unity platform, using arrests, force, and restrictions on assembly. The introduction of the bill was likely driven by the fallout from the January 2026 election, during which human rights groups and NGOs widely criticized the government for its crackdown on opposition activity. The bill closely resembles similar foreign agent or foreign influence laws passed in countries including China, Russia, Hungary, Georgia, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. These measures have been widely criticized for reducing foreign oversight of government actions. In Africa, Zimbabwe introduced the Private Voluntary Organizations Amendment Act in April 2025. The law tightens NGO registration requirements, expands state oversight, and introduces penalties for activities deemed to support political parties. Amid the growing threat of demonstrations across sub-Saharan Africa, driven by rising living costs linked to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, as well as broader youth movements organized through social media, additional authoritarian governments will likely follow a similar path. In Kenya, demonstrations over rising fuel prices have already turned deadly, with further unrest likely if talks fail to deliver a lasting solution. On May 18th, demonstrations broke out in Nairobi as part of a nationwide transport strike amid rising fuel prices. Protesters burned tires and used stones to block vehicles on Kihunguro Road. Clashes were also reported on Thika Road, while much of the city centre was left largely deserted. Most schools switched to online learning during the protests. Police deployed tear gas and fired shots into the air to disperse demonstrators before later clearing improvised roadblocks. At least 4 people were killed, 30 were injured, and 348 were arrested. The strike was organized by the Transport Alliance, which condemned what it described as unsustainable government controls and rising fuel prices. The group stated that all public transport investors had agreed to implement a 50% fare increase in order to protect themselves against rising fuel costs. The protests were attended by matatu operators, privately owned minibuses used as shared taxis, as well as boda boda riders who operate motorcycle taxis. Taxi operators, cargo transporters, tourist vehicle operators, and some private motorists also took part. The strike was called off on May 19th after the government reached an interim agreement with associations representing bus and minibus owners. According to Interior Minister Kipchumba Murkomen, the strike has been suspended for 1 week to allow further talks to take place. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The demonstrations come amid fuel prices reaching record levels on May 15th, with petrol prices rising by 8% and diesel prices increasing by 23.5%. The increases followed a pump price review conducted by the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority on May 14th. The review reassessed fuel prices in the wake of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Kenya is heavily reliant on the strait for its oil imports. Under the government-to-government petroleum import framework established by the Ruto government in March 2023, Kenya receives supplies from Saudi Arabia's Aramco Trading, the UAE's Fujairah FZE, and ADNOC Global Trading, and Singapore's Enoch Singapore. While President William Ruto has not commented on the latest price increases, the National Chamber of Commerce and Industry stated that higher fuel costs would affect all commodities and services across the country. The previous EPRA decision to raise maximum fuel prices on April 15th also triggered calls for protests under the social media hashtag #RejectFuelPrices. Despite gaining traction online, the demonstrations remained relatively limited, with activists gathering near the Kenya National Archives in central Nairobi. 10 people were arrested and charged with blocking the free movement of people in the Central Business District, or CBD. The current fuel prices are set to remain in place until June 14th, when EPRA is expected to conduct another review, something highly likely to trigger further demonstrations. Similarly, if the government fails to reach an agreement with transport associations, further protests are also highly likely. While President William Ruto has not commented on the latest price increases, the National Chamber of Commerce and Industry stated that higher fuel costs would affect all commodities and services across the country. The previous EPRA decision to raise maximum fuel prices on April 15th also triggered calls for protests under the social media hashtag #RejectFuelPrices. Despite gaining traction online, the demonstrations remained relatively limited, with activists gathering near the Kenya National Archives in central Nairobi. 10 people were arrested and charged with blocking the free movement of people in the Central Business District. The current fuel prices are set to remain in place until June 14th, when EPRA is expected to conduct another review, something highly likely to trigger further demonstrations. Similarly, if the government fails to reach an agreement with transport associations, further protests are also highly likely. Elsewhere in Africa, protests in Comoros have forced the government to suspend planned fuel price increases, though tensions remain high. On May 16th, the Comoros government announced the suspension of fuel price increases that had originally been unveiled on May 9th. The decision followed violent protests in Mutsamudu, the capital of Anjouan, one of Comoros's 3 main islands, where demonstrators blocked roads and clashed with security forces. At least 1 person was killed and 5 others were injured during the unrest. A judicial investigation has since been opened into the circumstances surrounding the death, which occurred in Mpage. Protests began on May 11th after major transport operators and shopkeepers launched a strike in response to the government's announcement of a 46% increase in diesel prices and a 35% increase in petrol prices. The strikes effectively paralyzed public transport in Moroni, the capital. The unrest escalated on May 15th following a meeting between the mayor of Mironsi and the Fishermen's Association, whose members had joined the strike on May 13th. So far, 39 people have been detained. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Comoros is a small island economy with no meaningful domestic oil production. It depends on imported fuels for transport, electricity generation, aviation, fishing, and household kerosene. The World Bank specifically highlights the country's high import dependency, limited export diversification, and vulnerability to external shocks. That means Comoros is almost certainly exposed to a closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The large increases in diesel and petrol prices almost certainly reflect Comoros's high dependency on imported fuel. Demonstrations have already succeeded in forcing the government to temporarily suspend the fuel price increases. While transport workers and merchants' unions decided to end their strikes following the suspension, any continuation of protests is almost certainly contingent on talks with the government. If those talks fail to produce a meaningful outcome, a return to demonstrations is highly likely. There is currently no scheduled date for the talks, but they will likely take place in the coming week. Comoros has a recent history of violent protests, with multiple waves taking place in 2018 and 2019. In March 2018, tens of thousands of people protested daily in Mayotte, calling for Comoran civilians on the island to be sent to Comoros. The following month, Comorans held counter-demonstrations, urging the national government to respond and renewing calls for Comoros to reclaim the French-administered territory of Mayotte. In June and July 2018, mass protests took place again, led by the opposition against a referendum on constitutional terms. The demonstrations lasted for a week, with police responding through repression and force, arresting 3 people. Further demonstrations followed the 2019 presidential election, during which 2 people were killed in clashes. Multiple African countries have seen major fuel price increases. Lesotho, South Africa, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Namibia have all experienced significant price rises and fuel shortages in recent weeks, or are particularly exposed to oil shocks caused by a closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Landlocked countries that rely on fuel imports, including Malawi, Zambia, and Botswana, are also especially vulnerable to the strait's closure. According to Malawian officials, the country's fuel reserves have reportedly completely run out. The demonstrations in Comoros are also taking place alongside similar protests in Kenya. It is likely that a successful and highly visible wave of fuel protests will inspire similar demonstrations in other countries across the region, particularly given that the Comoros government has already been forced to backtrack on its fuel price hikes. And in South Africa, a dispute over unpaid electricity debts could result in major power cuts across Johannesburg from July. On May 19th, Eskom, the state-owned power utility, issued a notice stating that the city of Johannesburg and its municipal distributor, City Power, owe the company a combined $308 million, with a further $94.8 million due by June 5th. According to the statement, Eskom had attempted to work with the Johannesburg Metropolitan Municipality for more than 2 years. However, due to repeated defaults, Eskom has been forced to issue a notice of its intention to reduce, interrupt, and slash or terminate the supply of electricity to certain bulk supply points. The statement added that Johannesburg authorities have collected money from electricity users without transferring Eskom's share. If the debt dispute is not resolved, Eskom's planned interruptions are due to begin from July 8th. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Businesses on the City Power municipal network would highly likely be the primary targets of any supply cuts. This would almost certainly affect offices, factories, retail centers, restaurants, warehouses, data centers, workshops, clinics, and small businesses in the affected supply zones. Johannesburg is South Africa's financial and commercial centre, contributing approximately 16% of the country's GDP and hosting the headquarters of several multinational companies and major African banks. Reduced energy supply from City Power would highly likely curtail trading hours and output, while increasing reliance on diesel generators at a time when diesel costs are already elevated by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. This would almost certainly intensify economic strain on many businesses and households by increasing essential fuel consumption. The impacts are likely to be more severe in less affluent areas of Johannesburg. The situation would highly likely trigger civil unrest in Johannesburg. A reduction in energy supply would also highly likely increase crime risks. Localized outages affecting street lighting, CCTV, alarm systems, and access control would almost certainly reduce deterrence and response capability, particularly at night. Criminals in South Africa often take advantage of load-shedding periods to carry out home burglaries, cable theft, and carjackings. Robbery, theft, and violent crime are particularly sensitive to power outages. Traffic lights would also highly likely be affected. This would almost certainly cause transport disruption, including congestion, longer journey times, and delays to business operations. Finally, in Asia-Pacific, widespread flooding across southern and central China has caused significant disruption, with further impacts expected as heavy rainfall continues. Heavy rainfall has triggered widespread flooding, killing at least 22 people, leaving at least 20 missing, and forcing the closure of schools and businesses. Transport networks and power supplies have also been severely disrupted. China's weather agency has warned that Jiangxi, Anhui, Hunan, Hubei, Guizhou, Guangxi, Guangdong, and Hainan face a high risk of landslides, flash floods, severe urban flooding, and waterlogging. authorities have introduced emergency measures in affected areas, including relocating residents in parts of Hubei and Hunan. In the early hours of May 18th, a magnitude 5.2 earthquake in Guangxi killed 2 people and forced more than 7,000 residents from their homes in Luzhu city. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The heavy rainfall, stretching more than 1,000 kilometers across China, has been caused by the convergence of moisture from the Bay of Bengal, the South China Sea, and the Pacific Ocean. Its slow-moving nature has allowed rainfall to accumulate, exacerbating the flooding. In the coming days, the system is expected to bring further moderate to heavy rainfall across large parts of China, with some areas likely to experience torrential downpours. This will highly likely trigger flash flooding, landslides, urban waterlogging, and disruption to transport, power, and communications infrastructure in additional provinces. The rainfall has broken multiple local historical records, particularly in central Hubei province. The resulting flooding almost certainly risks overwhelming emergency response efforts, with damaged roads and bridges complicating access to many of the affected areas. In addition, the widespread extent of the rainfall will likely stretch response capacity beyond its limits, placing further strain on shelters and healthcare provision. This situation will almost certainly be exacerbated by the earthquake in Guangxi, which has already damaged infrastructure across the region. Even as the rainfall begins to ease, secondary impacts are highly likely to persist for several days. These include localized power outages, school and business closures, and the contamination of water supplies. Further evacuations are likely in low-lying areas of the worst affected provinces, particularly Hubei, Hunan, and Guangxi, as well as in communities located along major rivers. Communications will highly likely be disrupted for several days, particularly where flooding, landslides, or power outages restrict access to damaged telecommunications, infrastructure, and delay repair work. This will likely complicate evacuation coordination, emergency response efforts, welfare checks, and the dissemination of public warnings, especially in rural or mountainous communities where network redundancy is limited. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.